Thank you for all sharing a little bit about what your relationship is to grief and where you are even within, we'll say, the grief process. Because in some ways, grief is all around us all the time. And it may be part of the reason why we don't talk a lot about it, because to think about grief is to realize just how much we're grieving at any given point. Of course, there's grief related to loss and death. And yet there's also grief related to the lives that we didn't live, collective grief. I'm going to go over some of the different types of grief in this presentation. So this is in partnership with Pineapple Support, which is a platform who provides mental health care and services to the sex work industry. And I love Pineapple Support and I do a lot of work with them. So when they initially approached me about doing this webinar or workshop, I said, of course, I'm happy to do it. Okay. I think I was mentioning a little bit about me and how grief has been in my own life. I am connected to grief in personal and professional ways. I am a clinical psychotherapist. I'd consider myself a holistic therapist. I do somatic work. I'm trained in EMDR. I taught yoga for over a decade. I teach embodiment. And then I wrote a book about trauma. So grief touches my professional work in that way. And then in my personal life, I was initiated, I guess you could say, I was initiated into grief through very traumatic loss of my brother. And I'm also grieving ailing parents and all the other pieces of life. So it's not something that I haven't experienced and know just how intense grief really can be. So first of all, I'm just going to give a little overview of kind of like what grief is, right? I don't know how much we have in terms of grief literacy. It's something that is seen to be a problem often that should be fixed. Like you're sad, there should be a timeline, and then you're supposed to just move through it. And then it be done and wrap it up in this nice little bow. And anyone who's ever grieved anything, I think, knows it's not a problem to be fixed. In fact, it doesn't have to be fixed. It's not a thing to fix. It is a process, a human process that we have to be able to be with and go through. So despite society minimizing it or maybe misunderstanding it or wanting to throw, pleasantries or positivity washing over it, that's not what grief actually is. And grief can also make us feel a bit powerless because there is so much pain, I think, involved in grief. And humans often don't want to feel pain. Again, something we feel like we need to fix or work away or somehow manage, which is, again, why I said why it's hard to call this a workshop. I'm going to include a lot of prompts because I do think grief is a very personal process. And we're allowed to have our own process. The grieving person gets to decide how they want to manage and navigate their grief and what it's going to look like and feel like for them. So I think prompts can help with your own reflective process and allow you the space to tend to your grief or be with your grief in a way that's going to work for you and help you to feel, I don't even want to say better, but the most optimal for you in your grief process. So when we look at grief, it's very much a system of coping with loss. As I said, it's a human process and it is a very human response to loss. Grief in itself is not linear. It doesn't follow this clear path. I know a lot of times we hear about grief goes in phases. I do think there are phase parts of grief, but it is not in this nice package of you feel this, then you feel this, and then you feel this, and then you feel this. And somehow certain feelings are better than the others. Like the anger and the bargaining part of grief is not good, but the seeing a silver lining or being thankful is somehow the good way to feel. There's not a good or a bad. There's all these different feelings that come and go in many different ways during the grief process. So it doesn't have to go in phases. It doesn't have to go in stages. If you identify with some of those, that conceptualization was actually quite revolutionary for its time. The woman who came up with it, and it was for people who had a terminal diagnosis, for them going through the phases of coming to terms with their own eventual death that might be sooner than they had planned. But it did give us some bit of a language to talk about grief in a way where a lot of people didn't talk about grief at all. So I think it is beneficial. But I also want to validate that grief doesn't always go in these phases or stages. It's also important to note that grief is not just emotional. It is physical, it is mental, it's spiritual. It can exist just as much in your body as it does in your feeling sort of conceptualization. It can be in your heart, your body can ache, you can feel pain, like actual physical pain. You can feel exhausted, you can have changes in your appetite. You might feel the actual weight of loss, like just feels like you're carrying this weight of what you're losing, or feel like you're losing. Um, Grief can also be very isolating. We sometimes shame ourselves into how we think we're supposed to grieve, or the people around us are just as uncomfortable with grief. And I think oftentimes people are uncomfortable with grief because it is so human. They might say, "Oh, I can't imagine how that feels." But the reality is they can imagine it, and it is scary and painful and overwhelming. And instead of being with their own feelings, there's a powerlessness of, well, let me just, I want to fix this. Let me give them something positive. Let me tell them something. And in essence, they're saying, your feelings and what you're going through are too much for me. And I think that makes the grieving person feel like, oh, I can't I can't be sad anymore. I have to get it together. I have to move on. I have to fix this. I can't share in the way that I might need to because they can't hold it. So that then makes the grieving person maybe isolate themselves or spend more time alone or not really admit what they're really going through. And again, in any of the categories, whether it's mental, emotional, physical, spiritual. Um, Moving on to my next little note there, we're going to go over some myths about grief before I get into the types of grief that I've listed here. One of the myths of grief is that it is temporary and that it's this thing that you just get over. We have loss, we feel grief, and then we're done. And grief is more a process that evolves. I know many of you, if you've grieving, you've heard the idea that the grief doesn't get less. We just become a bigger container to hold it, or a more evolved container to hold it. And it's important to note that that is part of it so that we don't shame ourselves in terms of what the timeline is, because there isn't a timeline, as I said. Sometimes the first year of a major loss or traumatic loss, which I'll get into in a second, we're still coming to terms with it even being real. That may take a year or more. So to shame ourselves into saying, well, it's been 3 months or it's been 6 months, I should be, that's not going to be helpful. I think it's going to make us feel worse as grieving people. The next myth about grief is that it's just sadness. It's just sadness. Grief is just sadness. When really grief is many emotions. There can be anger, there can be disappointment, there can be relief, which is a confusing emotion, I think, when it involves grief. There can be confusion in itself. There can be disillusionment. There can be hopelessness. There can be a sense of resolution, depending on what happened. So a lot of the emotions and feelings that come up with grief have to do with our own stories, our own histories, the connection we have to what it is that we're losing, whether it's the idea of a life, hope, a person, a relationship, all of the things in that category and what the meaning is for us is, I think, more linked to what kind of emotions and feelings we're going to have in our grief. And if we move into what the actual feelings, like sensations of grief might be, just to maybe validate some of the feelings around it, there's often a sense of numbness or being numb, feeling lost. We can have executive or cognitive functioning can change, so our thinking can really seem off. A lot of times I've talked to grieving people who talk about dissociating and just going through the motions of like, I'm doing things that I'm supposed to do. I just don't know how I'm doing them. I'm just getting from point A to point B, and that's all I can get through. And that's okay, by the way. There's no particular right or wrong way to grieve. There can be a lot of loneliness, as I mentioned before, anger. There can be bitterness, resentment. There can be a sense of sorrow. And difficulty socializing is also sometimes part of grief. It's really hard sometimes to be around other people when we are in such a place of feeling that is different from how we have felt before. There can also be changes to your immune system. So sometimes people find that they're catching colds, or they're more apt to get sick, or they're having more issues with any other health related item that they may be going through. So flare ups of arthritis, or flare ups of migraines, or anything else that has to do with actual stuff in the body that's happening. Another myth, and this is the last one before we go into these types of grief, just to kind of talk about those, is that grief should be private. Again, moving to the point of grief sometimes feeling shameful, a lot of times we think if I'm experiencing this huge loss and it's so overwhelming for me, I should just deal with this in private. I can't let anybody else know or feel with me or be there for me. And sometimes I think solitude is needed. Even my own history with grief, the time I set aside to be by myself and grieve in the way that I needed to grieve was very big in terms of the process of how I got to feel even a little more like myself over many years. But grieving openly and honestly and letting ourselves be seen in that way can be really powerful and can be really healing. A lot of times those relationships and being able to be around people who love us and can hold space for us can be very important in the grief process. So it doesn't have to be private. Okay, moving along with a few prompts as well. So there's a lot of different types of grief, right? As I mentioned before, we're all kind of grieving something all the time, and there's different, I'd say, weights of grief. And the first one that is quite a heavy weight of grief is a traumatic loss, which is loss that is sudden, unexpected, or violent. Feelings that accompany that can be things like shock or anger, more confusion, a lot of fear. It can leave our nervous system very heightened. We can also become super sensitive to losing something again. I think this happens with all grief, but especially traumatic loss, is that we suddenly think, I can't lose anything else. We get very attached to people or places or things, or there's such a hypersensitivity and a hyper arousal around, oh my gosh, I've lost something and it was so unexpected and I can't lose anything else. So it just, again, I mentioned a lot of this to normalize the feelings and processes that go around different types of grief. And traumatic loss can really complicate the healing process, especially if there's not answers, if we don't know. Our brains like to put things kind of in an order. This happened because this happened because this happened. It doesn't make grief any less, like when we know someone is sick or we know someone is elderly or we know something is going to happen. It doesn't make it less. But traumatic loss in particular has a lot of kind of holes in the narrative in our mind of what was happening or could happen. And that can make us very uncomfortable and can be really difficult in how we process it. Moving on to another type of grief is ambiguous loss. So ambiguous loss is when there's no clear closure. This happens a lot when either someone is missing, a relationship ended without explanation, we're grieving something that isn't actually physically gone. It's still a sense of loss, but it's floating around in some way. This can also happen when people are not physically gone, but we have lost them in many other ways, be it to illness, addiction, dementia. It's a loss that feels really unresolved, and it's a lingering grief. And because some of this can last for years and years, it becomes like a grief that we just have with us almost all the time. But it is still worth noting and being with and tending to in the ways that we can. So ambiguous loss is basically grieving something that's still there. The next one is disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is often called hidden grief or sorrow, and it's any grief that goes unacknowledged or like invalidated, basically. This can happen a lot with social norms around what we should feel okay with and what we should feel like lost with and what we shouldn't. A lot of rules there. So disenfranchised grief is often minimized, and it can be really hard to process and work through because we feel like we can't talk to anybody about it. This can be any sort of unrecognized relationships, lovers, teachers, mentors, people that you're close to, but maybe a friend that you had a falling out with, that you're like, I'm feeling lost about this person, but I can't talk to anyone about this. People around us we lose who have criminal histories, abortion, death by suicide is one of them that's kind of disenfranchised. It's hard to resolve a lot of that grief. So it can also have to do with possessions or places. When we lose a country, we lose a home, we lose part of our identity. Even a loss of culture is a form of like disenfranchised grief. So still grief, just a different kind. Moving along to anticipatory grief, which that is grief we have when we know loss is coming. This happens a lot with elderly parents or someone who is sick. We know that this is happening. It hasn't happened yet. So again, it falls into a category of it's difficult to talk to people about it because we think grief is only this one thing. It's only when a person passes away. When really it's still grief and we're still grieving. It's just unfolding. And that can bring up lots of feelings within that grief process of dread, anxiety, guilt, shame for grieving something we haven't lost yet, like guilting ourselves into I should be thankful I still have time, or again, almost gaslighting positivity, washing ourselves like you shouldn't feel bad, you still have them, all the things we tell ourselves, or it could be worse, or all these things that actually don't make us feel any better. Okay. The next one is, I want to mention it, is prolonged grief, which is in the DSM-5 as I think is bereavement disorder or prolonged grief disorder. I don't think grief is a disorder. Again, even the mental health profession wants to kind of fix things at times. We want to see something, we want to categorize it, and we want to be able to put a one-to-one, this is how you fix this thing. You need to cook this, you need an oven. Like we want to just make it a process that makes sense. And so grief, I don't think, is a disorder. However, prolonged grief lasts a really long time. And I would say that it's grief that is potentially, how do I say this? Not stagnant, but categorized in a place of almost unable to even be with the grief. Like, I'm not going to look at it, I'm not going to be with it. So it gets stuck in a way. And sometimes we can be stuck in that because we're not allowing ourselves to grieve. So grief can become really prolonged in a deeper way because we're not able to be with it or talk about it or think about it. And so that's why I mentioned prolonged grief. But it's important that we really challenge the idea that grief can never be too long, because I don't think it can be. A lot of times when we lose something or we're grieving something, we carry it with us the rest of our lives, and it just becomes a part of the makeup of how we learn to navigate our lives at that point. Because sometimes with grief, people mention like wanting to go back to how they were, or when will I ever feel like I felt before? And you won't. There's not this version of you that can ever be the same because now this thing has happened, whether it's the loss of a person or of dreams or hopes or a place, we are changed. And so it's like, how can we find the new version of ourselves that integrates the experiences that we've had? Okay. The next one is collective grief, which I think a lot of people have been feeling the last, wild to say, but 5 years. The pandemic was very much a collective grief. That is a process where a group of people, whether it's a nation, a community, or even just a local area, experience like fallout from death or multiple deaths. This can be war, natural disaster, other events that result in multiple layered losses, generally loss of life, but can also be loss of place and history and culture and identity, etc. So collective grief, I think, is what a lot of people have been feeling, compounded onto maybe other forms of grief as well. During the pandemic, I think the second or third year of it, there was a statistic that I think it was 1 in 7 people or 1 in 9 people were grieving the loss of someone. And that might have been a conservative estimate because we're still grieving people, even if they were not 1 or 2 degrees connected to us. So wanted to really affirm that as well. And then some prompts, if you want to write them or think about them or just hold them with yourself, is what role has grief played in your life? What are you grieving? And that might be a really long answer, depending on what's going on in your life. How do you experience your grief? Doing a lot of somatic work. I always invite people to come back to what it feels like in your body. And if that's really tough and you want to kind of engage in a writing exercise here, you could describe grief, your grief. Does it have a color? Does it have a shape? Does it have a sensation? Is it a person? Is it personified? Does it have a voice? Is it, um, what is it for you? I think is one way to maybe be with grief and tend to it. And then that also connects to the next prompt is how would you describe grief? So same, but different. How we experience it might include more body sensations or what we do or don't do, and then how we would describe it. If you were telling someone about grief, what would you say? Okay. All right. Moving along. And also, I feel like someone might ask about what do you mean by body sensations? I mean anything from your heart feels broken, there's zinging, there's tingling, I have chest pain, I have shoulder pain, my shoulders feel heavy, my legs feel like air, I don't feel my legs, my arms feel weak, my hands feel weak, my muscles feel tight. There's tension. I want to just hold my shoulders up. I just want to curl my shoulders in. My head feels too heavy, just fatigue. I feel sleepy. My eyes want to close. Those are all kind of body sensations if we wanted a little more language around it. And I think some of why many of you came today was this idea of grief tending. How can we be with grief? One of the most powerful things someone said around me when I was really grieving was just be in your grief. Just, I'm in my grief. Be in your grief. And it was really validating to just know, oh, I can just be here. I can just be in this place. I don't have to change it. I don't have to fix it. I just, for today or this afternoon or tomorrow or that week, I'm just in it. And that was really affirming to even be able to use to describe it to people. Like I'm in my grief today. And that felt really nice. So in terms other ways that we can really be with grief, because I think there's an important idea, and Megan Devine talks about this, and she wrote one of the books I'm going to recommend on grief. Wonderful. About knowing the difference between pain and suffering. Pain we can be with. When we're getting to a place of suffering, we have to really think, what are we doing to help ourselves not suffer? So a lot of these are things that they're not going to immediately fix the grief. They're not going to immediately make it go away. However, they will help us not be in the suffering space so that we can just tend to and be with maybe the pain of grief. So some of these, I think, are things people know: self-soothing, self-care, and self-compassion is a big one. I'm going to give y'all a link towards the end of a website that talks all about self-compassion and has meditations and prompts and things that you can do. Being kind to ourselves is a huge part of the grief process. Can we be kind to whatever emotions we're feeling? Can we lean into not guilting ourselves, letting go of all those maybe preconditioned ideas of timelines or what somebody said, or even what, religious entities around us told us to do, or, letting go of maybe all of these things we told ourselves we were supposed to do, or how we were supposed to feel, or I'm letting this knock me off my feet, and all those things we do to judge ourselves. I think self-compassion is one of the biggest things we could do to let our grief just be, because grief doesn't always make sense. And sometimes we just need places where we can do things that don't always make sense and be okay with it and not hurt ourselves internally by shaming ourselves about it. Self-soothing is anything, acts of calming, comforting ourselves. Anytime we're in a place of emotional distress, it's really important to think, how can I nurture and nourish myself and take the best care of myself? Being gentle with yourself is also a part of that. Self-care, how can I take care of the things like making sure that I'm fed? That was a big one. Grief really can do a number on your appetite and your sleep patterns. How can I make sure that I'm getting the sleep that I can get when I can, and being okay and gentle with myself the nights that I can't sleep? What can I do that's still gentle and soothing, that's not just berating myself and staring at the alarm clock or at the clock or my phone? Let's be real. That's what we're looking at now. So think small, gentle, accessible types of practices that how can we just be good to ourselves when we're grieving? Next one is I put community care. Oh Lord, let's go back. Community care, allowing yourself to be seen. That's a bit of what I was mentioning around grief doesn't have to be private. Can we be in spaces like even this, but can we be in spaces where we're around people that are grieving, or we're also grieving, or we're around people who love us, or who support us? And it can be to be with the grief, but it can also be a place where we don't have to think about grief. Community care can also be being with friends that you don't talk about it with. And that can be such a relief, maybe for a grieving person, to be like, I think about this all the time. It is so heavy on me. And this one class I get to go to, this one group I get to go to, this one exercise class, whatever it might be, is a place I don't talk about it. I go watch sports on this one day, and it's the day I just don't think about grief. That's okay too. That can also be part of the process of needing spaces where we're not just so in it. Because as a grieving person, it's there whether we tell someone or not. We usually are still feeling it in many ways. The next one I mentioned is rituals and practices. These can be really powerful in terms of how we deal with the loss that we have. Different cultural identities have different ideas of dealing with grief. And so you might have things that have to do with when somebody passes, or when we lose something, or when we're moving on to another phase in our life where there's more of a ritual that is done. However, we can create these rituals or intentional practices for ourselves. Of course, these can be very personal. They can also be ones that are maybe a little more common, like lighting a candle for the person. Lighting a candle at any holiday or event that they would have been at with you. Doing something to celebrate either their birthdays or days that are meaningful. Always, carrying a little something when you do something I'm thinking about like a graduation, right? And if my brother couldn't see me, maybe I carry this one thing with me and he's there with me in spirit. You're allowed to define and dictate whatever these are for yourself, but they can be really helpful in terms of the process of grieving. And it's also a way to like honor your grief and then honor the person or thing that has been lost. So these don't have to be formal. They can be if you want them to be, but they don't have to be. It can be lighting, like I said, lighting a candle, writing a letter, or even just setting time aside. Every other week I set aside a time to walk in the park and talk to this person who passed in my life. Again, very personal, but can be very helpful. The next one I mentioned is allowing for or asking for and allowing for help. Grief can be really overwhelming. And as I was mentioning, sometimes our cognitive function it's just hard to remember things and to do all the things. We can ask for people to help us to do things, picking up kids, helping cook a meal. These are all things that are really helpful. These are also things that are helpful if you have people around you that are grieving. And sometimes it's good to not just say, hey, if you need something, let me know, but to kind of lay out like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can either, come get this or help you clean up, or I can just come sit with you, or we can go for a walk. You pick and you tell me, and that's what we'll do. Those can be really helpful. So letting other people help us, and it's not always perfect, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be. Just allowing other people to kind of hold you can be a good, helpful part of grieving. And then honoring your grief process, which I think is all that we're talking about today, is just really giving yourself the space to grieve in the way that makes sense for you. Um, Along with that, I would say really, take care of the basics, like make sure you eat, make sure you rest, all those things that still have to go on. And then I didn't put it here, but if you have a connection to spirituality or spiritual practice, that is also a powerful part of healing and moving through grief. If that resonates and identifies with you, a lot of people use prayer or meditation, or connecting with something greater than themselves in that process, and it can be helpful. This can also be journaling, breath work, meditation, heart-centered work, all ways that you can be with grief and honor grief. And again, very personal. Okay. Moving along. These are just some little images that come to mind when I think of grief. This idea of growing around grief, like the idea of what people think grief is, and then in reality, grief actually stays the same. We just create more of a container to hold it. Connection is the next point here. Grief is really a time to, if we can, find connection and be with other people so we don't have to grieve alone. And then this one is from, I wish I would have put her at handle. She does wonderful stuff around grief. Our increased sensitivity through grief can also make us more sensitive to the beauty around us. Um, I don't want to say that grief is this process that you find the silver lining in and suddenly everything's greater because you've had this loss. But I do think in being with our grief and being more open to all the pain, all the hurt, all the feelings, all the humanness of it, we also open ourselves up to so much more. I tell my clients this all the time. Expansiveness goes both ways. To cut ourselves off from hurt or pain is also to cut ourselves off from joy and beauty and all the wonderful feelings that life does offer, this imperfect, unexpected thing of life. So when we expand to feel both of them, we expand both ways. So there are moments of teaching and things that we learn from grief that we can and may, we don't have to, but we may appreciate in a different way in terms of how it changes how we live our lives. I know my life shifted greatly with the loss of my brother in terms of what I thought was important. My tolerance for things that just didn't serve me became very low. There was so much I thought about in terms of how I engage with people, like how much I tell them I love them, the time I spend, my priorities shifted. All these are part of grief. That I won't say we should be thankful for grief in that way, but it's okay to see all the aspects that grief may give us in terms of how we get to feel and how we get to live, and thus how we get to continue to live. Okay, moving along. More reflection questions. I do love a reflection question. And these are ones that you can answer or not, maybe in your own time. What were you taught or told about how you should grieve? And how does that feel to you? So these are things you can just keep with yourself and maybe work through at some point in your grief process. Next one, where do you feel your grief? Is it emotional? Is it mental? Is it all of the above? Is it physical? Next one, if grief had a texture or a sensation, what would it feel like? Similar to the previous question. Grief can feel never ending. How do you offer yourself grace instead of pressure to move on? What are some ways you can soothe yourself during grief? That is a bit of resourcing, which is something we do in therapy a lot, of listing out what are my resources? What can I go to? We often have way more tools within ourselves than we think. And sometimes having a little list or reminding ourselves of like, oh, these are the things that really work well for me can help us when we're in a really heightened moment and kind of grasping for something. Next one, are there rituals or intentional, meaningful practices that you create to honor your grief or the person or thing that you've lost? A little question about rituals. What spiritual or grounding practices can you lean into if that's something you're interested in? How can you return to the basics of care, eating, resting, and moving during this time? What might my grief care plan look like? And then what do I need to hear most right now? And I put that one there because sometimes everyone around us is just saying the wrong thing. They try with such good intentions and sometimes with such love, and they're just not saying the right thing. Or it just all feels a little off. And so it's important to even acknowledge to ourselves what we need to hear during our grief process. These are some of the resources I mentioned. There are so many resources, by the way, so many, but these are some that I think are helpful. The one on the bottom left, It's Okay, You're Not Okay, is Megan Devine's work. I think her work is amazing in humanizing grief. Um, the next one, When Things Fall Apart, that's a wonderful book. She also wrote How We Live is How We Die, which I think is a new one that came out. The Grief Deck, Rituals, Meditations, and Tools for Moving Through Loss, in case we're needing more ideas for that. Bearing the Unbearable was also a book about grief and loss that was very good. My Friend I Care, that is by a hospice nurse that talks about, they're very short books. So this is just one of, I think you can get them in a pack of like 1, 2, or 5. And it talks about the actual dying process. They're short. They're like 9 to 11 pages because when we're often grieving or overwhelmed with anticipatory grief or in the midst of everything, you don't need a 500-page book. You wouldn't be able to really get around it. It's Okay, You're Not Okay is also written in a way where you can kind of take it in pieces. You could open it up to any section at any given time and just read something and think, oh, okay, that was helpful. You don't have to go chapter by chapter. It's not one of those. And I think people who work in the grief space know that it's not an inappropriate time, nor could the grieving mind and brain and body really hold all of that. Um, so those are some interesting resources that I've found really helpful. The selfcompassion.org that I mentioned is a place where you can learn about self-compassion and how to be more compassionate towards yourself, which is a really big tool. Refuge in Grief is Megan Devine's website. So that It's Okay, You're Not Okay author's website. And she has a lot of resources of how to be there for other grieving people, how to be there for your own grief. My work, I listed myself. I do have a full highlight about grief, and I openly talk about my grief online. There was a time, I will say, that I told myself, like, you can't do this anymore. You're just overwhelming people. They don't want to hear about loss anymore. And I had to really process that for myself. So I'm right there with all of you if you're shaming yourself about your own process. I think it was a year or two into it, and I thought, this is all I talk about. All I talk about is loss. Um, and I should not have felt that way. So I'm always happy to talk about grief and field grief questions. I do question and answer. I try to do it every week or every other week where I answer questions and I answer them openly. So people talk about grief there. You want to hang out with me more? That's my email, my website, my social links. And then thank you all for listening to this chat about grief. I'm going to stop the recording, but we still have a few minutes to answer some questions or just talk if you want to.